This is an image that is familiar, this kind of image. I mean, if somebody told you that this picture was taken in Chattanooga 2 months ago, would you believe them?
Yeah.
The clothes might be different, but the action could be the same. The issue could be the same. The fact that you have young black men struggling in some sort of struggle is something that we're still dealing with over 60 years after this photograph was taken. This is part of a system of violence. This is part of the oppression of young black lives. That this is required for us to remain oppressed. The acceptance of this image, the pervasiveness of this idea that violence is part of black life is required for our continued oppression. Now, spinning off of that, when we're talking about systems of violence, any of you who read the synopsis for tonight's discussion know that I'm also going to be tying this into the LGBT community, which stands for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, because there are similar systems of violence that play into the oppression of LGBT people as well. Not the same, please note, not the exact same systems, but very similar systems that lead to very similar ends, the ultimate end being the threat to and the loss of lives. Now, when we talk about the idea of violence in the black community, what are things that come to mind?
Racism.
Racism, of course. Gangs. Drugs.
Poverty.
Police brutality. And that's right.
Sexism.
Prostitution.
Death.
Codes of silence. Now, by contrast, what are things that we think of when we think of violence for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people?
Bullying.
Hate crimes, bullying,
Also death.
also death,
Also self.
also self-hate,
Religious persecution.
religious persecution, discrimination, rejection from family. Actually, I would also like to tie in prostitution to also being an issue for the LGBT community too. As a result of largely from ejection from family, lack of resources, what sorts of things might a person face if they are, say, black and transgender? How might this change? What specific issues of systems of violence might impact that person's life more aggressively?
Classism,
I'm sorry?
classism,
Classism?
sexism, how people look at it.
How people look at them. Perception of them, yes.
Yeah.
Exclusion from one or both circles.
Exclusion from one or both circles. Let's say that a person who is African American comes out as transgender. Most transgender people find rejection when they come out as who they are, regardless of the race that that they were born into. So they have the ejection from family issue, tend to be on their own, loss of family, loss of friends, essentially being left on their own. And then even when trying to find inclusion in the LGBT community, one, transgender people generally have a harder time doing so, even among their own community, supposedly. And then on top of that, being a person of color, that person may not find spaces where they feel welcome. They may not find spaces where they find people who they can actually connect to, which leads to isolation, then thereby makes them more at risk for a whole slew of factors, having to live on the streets, not having any kind of means of income, not having a way of even protecting themselves should they find themselves at risk for violence. And it was mentioned earlier also the idea of police brutality being an issue. For the black community, it's also an issue for the LGBT community. The other day when I was preparing for this presentation and discussion, I came across an interesting statistic. I was looking at reported violent crimes against LGBT people. And gay men are the most likely group within that community to report a crime to the police. They're also 2 to 3 times more likely to be brutalized by the police. Anyone care to take a stab at why that might be?
They're different.
Different.
And it's easy.
Hmm?
It's easy.
It's easy. I mean, it's easy to brutalize those populations.
That's right, because there's not a lot of people standing up.
It targets the weak.
The target weak.
Most forms that you fill out, you have to, identify as male or female, and transsexual or transgendered is not offered as an option.
Most policemen are white male.
Because of that mistrust of authority figures that is well earned and comes from actual experiences within their communities and oftentimes individual experiences with those authority figures, we don't report crimes as often as we should. We severely underreport crimes, both in the Black community and the LGBT community, because of fear of that authority figure. That if you call the police, it's only going to get worse. So that's an issue. That's a big part of that. The bigger picture on that system of violence is it feeds itself. It sustains itself. And it also keeps us separated, because we talk about the idea of differences. We talk about the idea that, we mentioned legislation, anti-gay legislation. There's also legislation that actively works against Black people. Still, to this day. But last year, they just repealed a good chunk of the Voter Rights Act, which largely, disproportionately negatively impacts Black communities who just want to vote. A simple, constitutionally guaranteed right. So these battles continue in different ways, and if you have rhetoric that's going around that's supporting legislation like, I don't want to serve gay people in my business because that's my right as a business owner, you start doing that, and it makes this group of people less. There's a quote from Coretta Scott King, and I'm going to paraphrase, so forgive me if I butcher it, but she asserts that homophobia, like racism and anti-Semitism, thrives on the dehumanization of people. That is a very loose paraphrasing, so if anybody looks that up, I know I ruined it, but that's the gist of it. And it's the idea that these systems are to devalue people, to make it acceptable to hate, exclude, and harm people.
Incarceration rates are astronomical, and that has changed in the last 20, 30 years. It's,
Change for the worse.
yeah. We have a new slave system, and it is corporately owned prisons.
Right.
When you make money off of prisoners, you have an incentive to imprison people.
Keep it.
Yes.
So we have a more efficient prison system that is geared towards not only incarcerating, especially young Black men, disproportionately young Black men. So those are the reasons that it's continued. How can we change it?
But now we've got guns. My gosh, stand your ground. The whole South, I mean the country too, but the whole South stands your ground. It's white privilege, it's white males, it's the macho. It's you're not going to take by gosh, I don't know what we do about it.
Seeking out community leaders, business owners, and providing them with capital to enhance their own operations. I mean, interpersonal and educational investment, where people go into communities and spend more time cultivating relevant skills, things of those nature, so that what you're doing is enhancing the culture and the local economy, rather than buying properties out from under people, making property values too high so that people can't pay their rent, can't pay their property taxes, and so on and so forth.
When I first came in here, I was immediately drawn to that piece, and I wanted to do a discussion so badly around that piece. That piece is actually inspired by listening to improvised jazz and blues. The artist was listening to this musical piece being created on the fly, all of these different musicians coming together, playing different instruments, slightly different styles, and this is what was created from that experience. And his name is jazz and blues are very near and dear to my heart as an artist, as a performer. And I kind of think that the way that we solve this, the way that we get away from this image 60 years from now being an artifact, how we make this something that is simply a dark portion of our past, is if we start working together more like that. If we take our differences, all of our different colors and styles, all of our personalities, all of our different visions and experiences, and we bring them together for the common goal of making something beautiful. Our society, our culture, our city. and we stow away our differences, and we simply try to harmonize. And it won't always be perfect, but sometimes the imperfections are what makes it better.